we have Robin Schard, who is the Associate Director of the University of Miami Law Library. And like I said previously, her hands-on activity is available for download on the Symposium website. So hopefully you guys got it all. And take it away, Robin.
Thank you, Heather, and thank you for sharing that link so everybody can see the sample document while I'm actually talking about it, I suppose. And please feel free to make any comments along the way. Just a little bit about me. As Heather said, I work at the University of Miami, so hopefully after hearing from Bill, you have an idea of what that means. But my earliest work with disaster plans actually came when I was working in the public libraries in the Mid-Atlantic. I worked at 2 public libraries. One was about 2 blocks from the Atlantic Ocean, and one was about 10 feet from the beachfront. And neither one had a disaster plan. So that was when I, after one winter storm, decided that there should be some plan or some way to go about that. And just not to call on any specific Miami-based schools, but I did contact them, and it was after one of their large hurricanes. And way back then, they didn't have a disaster plan either. So don't tell anybody I told you that. But so that's when I started creating some disaster plans. Since then, just to give you an idea of some of the disasters that I've been through, winter storms and nor'easters, big thing as just heard about in Connecticut, also other parts of the Mid-Atlantic. Flooding, obviously I'm in Miami, so hurricanes, broken pipes, other construction disasters, and mold, just to name a few. So we've had a lot of practice, unfortunately, with dealing with disasters large and small. As we're going through this, by the way, I know a lot of people have asked for questions to be held off to the end of the presentation, but if you have a question about a section that I am talking about, please go ahead and ask it at the time. But if it's just about the plan as a whole, feel free to wait till the end, and I will be able to stay for a while. As with most other people, I am just one part of a larger organization. So a lot of the things that the entire organization might need to deal with, I haven't included here. Things like HR, co-location sites for our websites. The university has promised that they will be responsible for things like single sign-on. So those are not in this plan, but you may need to, depending on your situation, include them in your own plan. Not all of the things in these plans will be appropriate for everyone, so you can mix and match what you need. Our university also has a cloud-based disaster or emergency planning database that they've created. And just sort of a fun fact, which we didn't realize until we were in the middle of this pandemic, the example that they use for their disaster is actually a flu-like pandemic. So they apparently had some idea of what they were looking to expect, even if we did not. The plan that I gave as an example is, or that you should be able to see online as an example, is one that parts of which we have refined a lot over the years, and that's particularly Bill Latham, who you heard from earlier, and also the previous director of the law library, Sally Wise. Unfortunately, we have not had the chance for our emergency plan to get old and stale. With hurricanes happening fairly regularly, or at least the threat down here happening fairly regularly, we do get a lot of practice. Very jealous of that Boston Museum that wanted to try out their disaster plan, where we unfortunately get to practice it fairly often. All right, so moving on to the plan. One of the things, the first things, right, the last updated date, very important. We do update ours every year, but that's because we have our most likely disaster to be an annual event, a June to November event, so we know when we want to look at it, and also have a single person that's responsible for that. Although that person works with many different people, we want to make sure that there is a point of contact for any questions about the plan. So the first 2 parts are actually what I consider the most important parts of the plan, and those are the calling tree and the personnel directory. The calling tree is Very important to keep track of how everyone in your staff is doing. And we actually used it during the pandemic to make sure that everybody was on the same page as far as closing dates and times and who was doing what. So you never know when you're going to be using it. So what we found out with the calling tree is that you do want to have dispersed responsibilities, because you don't know who is going to, or which leaf is not going to be available. So you don't want everything requiring a single person to contact. We've also had trouble after hurricanes with things not working. So it may take one person longer to get their cell service again or to get electricity again. And so you want to be sure that there are lots of different people and leaves that you can skip to. But you don't want anyone to be like six hours after getting a call everyone else did. So you don't want to go too deep. If you have a very large organization, you may want to start with a plan for the departments and then narrow it down to individual people. So in the box that you may see on the plan, in the boxes we include the name and cell phone number, even though we have more information in the personnel directory. And we have gone through and done a lot of training with people to make sure that they will call the next person on the leaf in either direction, up or down, to be sure that the information or the communication is going forward, even if somebody is missing or not yet in contact. Not really missing, hopefully, but not yet in contact or not yet able to contact. So that's important to keep people open to that. And to that point, you also want to be sure that you are considering interpersonal relationships, right? You want people to be on the same plan or on the same tree with people that they're comfortable calling. And that's true when you get to the last line of contact. It's best if you can get somebody that is comfortable calling whoever they're supposed to call. There's a question about when do we update the plan? We usually schedule to update our plan in May and hold a hurricane meeting either in May, although usually it's a June meeting after the school year is finished. This year we kind of had to do it on the fly because nobody was here in either May or June, or we weren't together. So we did this separately. All right, it's good. So calling tree, very important, as is the personnel directory. The university actually has a place on our university personnel system where you can update your emergency contacts. But, as we already heard, right, that's going to require you to continue to have access to the internet and authentication and the cloud system to be able to get that information. And so we try to get all of the staff, and everyone is happy to do that down here anyway, provide as much information as possible so we can all have that information. So the first is the address. It's not 100% necessary, but sometimes it helps us tell if an area of Miami has been hit harder than another area. It gives us an idea of why someone may be taking longer to get in touch with us, and so we can follow up with that. Yep, telephone, the landlines are the most reliable, but who the heck has a landline anymore? If you can, that's great. We gave up that fight a while ago. Even if you have a landline, then you have to have a phone. If your electricity's out, you have to have a phone that doesn't have any features that require electricity, so no cordless or anything. So it's kind of become a little old and out of date. Cell phones, everybody pretty much has those, right? You can't live without one now, but you still will lose cell service. In fact, after the last storm, I got my electricity back way before my cell service. So you never know kind of what order things are going to come back together. Same thing with the email. Oh, and by the way, someone already mentioned this. All of a sudden after a storm, you have everybody trying to call everybody. And so even if your cell towers are still not affected, you still have so much traffic that you can't get through. So any other additional options are useful. We have had times where the email during the move to a co-location site, our email has been down temporarily. So we also have an alternate email address. Last season, some of the communications group did start a WhatsApp group as well, so we can communicate that way. So that's another option. And last and hopefully least is the emergency contact, and hopefully an emergency contact outside the area. Again, even though the person may be still in the area, they may, well, I know for a fact, as I said, my cell coverage didn't come back for a long time, but I had a neighbor whose cell phone was up. So the first thing I did was call my family. They, of course, didn't pick up because they didn't recognize the number. And I'm not sure what that says about how worried they were about me, but never mind. That's for a different symposium than this one. All right, so that's all of the information in the personnel directory. If you can get everybody to provide that information, it's great. That is something you're going to want to update as frequently as you can. Whenever you get new employees, it's a good thing to put on your new employee checklist to kind of think about this, because this current event happened in a little bit odd time in the year for us. We actually did have to scramble and get a few people's contact information before we left in March. So those two parts, the calling tree and the personnel directory, if there's any part of this plan that you're going to update or that you are going to work on as a new plan, those are the most important parts, in my opinion, right? People more important than anything in the library. And it works with lots of different types of emergencies, right? Not just hurricanes for us, but pretty much any type of emergency. So it's really a useful part to have, even if you don't have every other part of your disaster plan. So if you are building a disaster plan from scratch or greatly updating one, I wouldn't try to cover every single emergency that could possibly be out there. And I think a few other speakers have discussed which ones to focus on and which ones to decide are the most likely ones for you to worry about, or the most important ones for you to worry about before going further. So I would start with those and expand from there. Your disaster plan or your emergency plan will never be 100% complete, in my opinion. It's always a work in progress, always something that you're adding to. So much more controversial, right? There are some things that we don't include in the plan because you need to respond so quickly that it's a matter of training more than planning. Now, training is planning, I know, so it's not exactly 100% true, but for example, the evacuation in a fire and active shooter, we do those trainings regularly for the staff. And it's not something where we're going to go and get the disaster plan or pull up the disaster plan on the computer to find out what we're supposed to do. Our institution actually does provide books with that information in there, and never mind. But I can't, they are great. And if I could find one when the fire alarm goes off, I think it will be very useful. But in any case, we don't tend to focus on that with our emergency plan. We do provide the training fairly regularly. Even if you don't have every emergency considered in the plan, other parts of the plan will work for different emergencies, right? So what is mostly a hurricane plan in our case, parts of it worked for our current situation or the pandemic. We've also used it for the leaky pipes or broken pipes, pretty massively broken pipes sometimes, but those same kinds of things will work if you have different parts of a plan created, even if it's not on the list. So many people have talked about who to contact in an emergency. The most important thing is to have that list somewhere and accessible. Some you need to have more quickly than others, some you can wait for. So for example, we used to have more vendors on our emergency contact list, but now they're usually not an early contact for us. And so as long as we can access them through our library system or whatever, then that works out pretty well. But certainly a restoration company, we do have one already in the system for us, and we do have a PO for them every year. So if we have an emergency, we have a quick way to get them. We have specific contacts within the company that we do update when we're updating the policy. Our PO is updated every year. So that's certainly a group. Definitely security. If you have a number before 911 that your organization prefers you to contact, that's very important to have on there. Once you get to 911, it's probably not necessary, but we do have public safety that we contact for some emergencies before then. So we want to have their separate contacts there. Whenever we have emergencies, we also have other on-campus people that we contact. So for example, the facilities departments, feels like almost every week we're calling our facilities departments for disasters, large and small. Since the library operates on extended hours anyway, we always have an after hours contact for the facilities departments. We normally also work with other libraries on campus or in the area, so we always have a person that we contact for any issues. That's true not only to kind of coordinate our schedules and what we're doing, or to have someone to talk to that's also dealing with the issue that you're dealing with, but also because they have supplies that we may not have, freezers and things like that for smaller disasters. So they're also useful to have on here, a specific person to contact. We also may work with or have to report our changes for emergencies to our PR, the university, the bigger institution's PR department. They're communicating out to our constituents. It's always useful to have somebody that you can let know that. Whether they want to include it or not in the communications is up to them. So for example, usually it doesn't go so high, but last hurricane season, I had to actually do an update for the provost, but normally it's just kind of PR. As I mentioned, fewer vendors, but if there are any that you know you're going to need, this is a good place to have that just for when you need it. Insurance, contacts, and anyone else that you're going to need to notify that there's an issue ever. So you'll see that in the examples, I have different formats. You do want to have all different types of contact and people's names if you have them. It just makes it a little easier when you're doing things in an emergency to keep everything together. All right, so emergency contacts, so that's part of your communication plan, and the other part is getting communications out in all different formats that the library is communicating with people. And I think probably a lot of us saw during this current situation that it's not always easy to remember what all of your different places that you provide information to your patrons or users or constituents are. And also earlier we talked about people reacting different ways to these types of situations. And that's also one of the reasons why you'll see that we prefer to have a specific person designated as the person responsible for changing a communication or doing a specific thing. And that's just to get people to be able to know what to do when they are nervous or in a panic. You know, sort of like with CPR, when you learn CPR, one of the reasons that they teach it in a specific way is so that when the emergency happens, you don't have to think about what to do, you just do it. Or at least that's the theory. Same thing here. If we have a specific person designated to update the main telephone, then they don't necessarily have to think, well, what am I supposed to do now if they're upset? It also gives people something to do. That's one of the things, like I said, we deal with hurricanes a lot. So one of the things that happens is that you get bombarded with information and rumors and hearsay. And again, giving people something concrete to do can be a big bonus to their own personal well-being. And that's kind of why we have more dispersed activities for the entire staff. And you also don't want to be trying to remember, you know, if we don't update the main university or the main library telephone message that often, you don't want to be now the time you have to find out all of that information. So on the screen now I have the sample messages. They work in almost all situations with minor changes, have used them for this particular emergency, and that seems to work. One of the other things that's listed here on the web page, we often forget there might be more than one place on the web page where we need to change information, whether that's upcoming classes or just hours and there and about. So this time that you're dealing with something that's happened is not necessarily the best time to try to remember all of those things. So the more information you can get on your communication plan ahead of time, the better. We also have a shared drive with the sample physical signs that we put up, which has a similar message already in place. By the way, the sample messages actually have the number. I don't know why I took them out, but it actually has the number of the university hotline that deals with disasters. So again, we're lucky that way that we have some experience, unfortunately. So the photographs, that was a new thing that we added 2 years ago. Sure, the rest of you had probably already been thinking about that, but for insurance and other purposes, it's really useful to have before pictures or to put things back the way that they are supposed to be in a particular order. The pictures are useful, and those are actually stored on the university site for our part, so they're actually in the cloud. Now, obviously, you're not going to get every square inch of a large library, but you can kind of get the bigger overall picture of what it's supposed to look like. And there are some collections where we spend more time taking pictures of the portions of the library. So we have separated out closing the library with details. Now, I can't give you details of all of the things that you need to think about, but these are some big things that you might want to think about. You have the communication being the first thing, not only to your constituents, but also to your own staff. A lot of, like I said, rumors and hearsay and other information floating out there around an emergency. So it's really useful to make sure that at least all of your staff know exactly the party line so that they know how to communicate as a whole. That's also the point where we agree on the message to be communicated, comparing it to the sample that we already have above. And that really knocks down a lot of the misinformation that can be going around. You may have a few minutes to make sure that your personal directory and calling tree are up to date. And although we do tell the staff to have the beginning of the hurricane season to make sure that they have the personnel directory and the calling tree with them to make sure that they get the most recent one. They actually get a copy of the entire plan that they can have in print that we have on the cloud. You can obviously download it to your own communication, but that's one way to keep everybody on the same page. So we do have, like I said, throughout, you'll see the list of closing operations. We do have a specific person designated. The person responsible for all of the closing procedures is the one who will be sure that if a person is not available, that somebody else can be thrown into that closing procedure. For us, I think Bill mentioned earlier, we have some known problem areas. So our closing procedure includes all of those different areas that we might move materials out of harm's way or that we might cover. So our list is actually considerably longer. And the other thing that's not on here, but it should be included, is that before people leave, they should, or after they leave even, they should notify their supervisors if they're planning on evacuating. So normally a lot of people know that when we're doing our closing procedures, but in any case, they should report that. And then the backup team, as I mentioned, very useful for evenings and weekends when everybody else can leave with just locking the door, but it may take a little longer to get the library to that point. Okay. So I did give you a couple of examples of emergency specific, very basic information for us. Again, with the rumor and hearsay, one of the most important things is getting consistent and useful and reliable information. So we do have specific sources of information on hurricanes. And not just NOAA. There's, the school has a department, the school has its own emergency website that it starts updating when a storm is within so many miles of the campus. And so we kind of have other contacts to keep track of what's going on with the storm. Obviously, you won't always have that. You might have that with hurricane, tornadoes, same thing. When between warnings and watches, you need to start paying attention at a specific point. So that kind of gives you the same idea. We're, basically the majority of what you're going to be doing in the hurricane is tracking it, figuring out what to do when the warning and watches show up, closing the library, and basically using other parts of the plan. The flood and the leak, you're using the same thing, figuring out where your supplies are, and then evacuating people out of the building and starting the recovery, which again, you have the recovery section. So speaking of getting supplies together, this is kind of the high level supplies. I'm sure everybody's got a different idea of what are the best supplies, and we've heard a lot of these throughout the day. Again, it's dangerous because everybody else has given fantastic information up until now that I can't get into the plan. So you do need to have probably more than this. Now, obviously, we don't have one flashlight. We have flashlights in multiple places throughout the library, and same thing with first aid kits. I've seen that both ways. Some people say put everything in one spot, and that way it's easily accessible. We always have a concern that that one spot will be inaccessible when we need supplies for recoveries. So most of our supplies are actually dispersed. If you are going to use this dispersed method, then you want to be sure that you can locate these supplies in a hurry. So that's why in the samples that are in the list on the website, it has a very specific location for that particular supply. And again, like I said, if we have different supplies in different departments, we're going to know that. And then that's also something, the supplies need to be checked at the same time that you're updating your plan, and make sure that they are where you say they are, right? We have first aid kits that might get used over the year and then need to replenish them. Obviously, flashlights and their batteries need to be checked and replaced whenever possible. We had a little TV that was battery operated, but then, with the change in the way that the non-cable TVs work, then you have to keep track of that. Plastic sheetings, we use that for lots of different things. We did have masks, luckily, when we had to start dealing with the mold, but, whatever emergencies you can get there. The library preparedness cartons, I don't know if everybody has those or has seen those, but they are good, particularly for leaks. In some cases, the mold as well. They have a bunch of supplies in one place, and you basically, including a plastic box, and you can just take that to wherever you have to deal with those things. So we have a few of those scattered throughout the library. Luckily, there used to be the old recovery wheels that would tell you how to deal with wet, particular types of material, books, and I'm trying to think, books and microfilm and those kinds of things. That has actually switched to an app, so you don't have to keep those wheels around. But again, it is relying on your apps being accessible at any specific time. So hopefully others will have some other ideas for supplies to keep, but those are kind of the major parts of our supplies. Okay, so continuing operation was not something we really had focused on, even though the university, like I said, the university system had pointed out a pandemic as something we should be planning for. But we had actually done the work from home information. And so that came in handy. We could easily respond to our administration about who could work from home, what information, what they had, and what they would need. And it made everyone a little easier for people to be able to deal with that situation. The critical applications, not so important here because most of these are cloud-based that we have on our list, but after a storm, having access to them is very important. That was, something we realized about our library, our LMS last year, was that we were all using authentication to get through it, and we needed to figure out who could get around the authentication should the university not actually be providing the single sign-on options that we needed. So there was a chance to update some of that information last year that would come in use. The critical functions, we had not really worked through the ways to cope. The university was still working on their, or the, I'm sorry, the law school was still working on their instructional application of that part of the plan. And that our response, we felt, was dependent on their response. And so that took us a little bit longer to get up to speed because we had not really paid that much attention to it. So, and these are all these, the university actually added all of these because of the hurricanes, but like I said, a lot of these are based on lots of different applications for different emergencies. And I did put the levels there because that's something the university had not provided the levels in the product. And so then, you know, we might put one for everything, and then the university's like, no, that's not right. You have to rethink that. So we realized we had to get on the same page with what they were thinking, and in what we were thinking were the most important things. So collection priorities, that is very useful. In a severe disaster, you're not going to be able to deal with everything at one point. You are going to have to get down to dealing with individual parts of the collection. And so setting priorities as far as what is most important is going to be very useful for that recovery. I think, for example, Bill mentioned that we have one room that has 2 stories of windows. So we try to make sure that nothing that is in that room is really going to be a high priority. So everything in there really needs to be replaceable, because it may look nice, but it's not the most secure, at least in this area. So, you know, the more detail you can get in your collection priorities, the better. But at, you know, at this point, if you're just starting out or just updating a plan, you may not want to spend forever trying to get this down. Obviously, things that are archival, not replaceable, and important for you to continue your operation should have a higher priority than things that are easily replaceable and not as used. We did move some of our archival material off-site with the university library, so that meant a lot more coordination, particularly when we're working on recovery and even checking in to see what we needed to be sure was secure and what the procedures were for tracking that. So the maps were, that was a result, we'll talk about it a little bit. The maps were a result of the actual debriefing that we did with the institution's emergency department. What they wanted, since they were the first ones that would be in the building and we would have to wait until they allowed us to be in the building, they wanted these clear and available to them when they actually came into the building, so that they would know specifically what parts of the library they needed to check first and what they needed to start the restoration on if they brought the restoration company in before they even let us in, what they needed to salvage first. So these are not only in our plan, but we actually leave those taped on the desk. We're supposed to be getting like poster size ones that we can just put in place of the maps on the floors, just to make it a little easier for them to find. But we were certainly glad that the emergency department was thinking about that when they actually came into the building. So that makes it a lot easier for them, and you know, it should make it easier for us, but in theory, we know where our collections are and we don't have that kind of granularity with the priority setting. So when you get to the recovery portion, others have talked more about the specifics for doing physical recovery and what things you should do with the recovery. So I don't have too much detail in there. But others have also mentioned you need specific people on a team if you are doing recovery. And so you should take some time to make sure that you have all of those people on the team. So you definitely need somebody that knows, either a preservation librarian or someone who has been trained, if you don't have your own preservation librarian or staff, in how to salvage the material based on what kind of damage you have to deal with. And we do include someone who manages the collection to decide what books or what print material or what microfilm material or what archival material is worth saving for damage. It's, you know, everybody, I think knows it's super expensive to actually go through a process to salvage material, physical material. And so you need to decide what is necessary or what is good, what needs to go through that process. You need somebody to decide when to call in your recovery company, and that is connected with what's going on at the main institution. It's also connected with the next thing, with who can spend money. I think just before we were talking about, is your bookkeeper available? Well, that's really useful to have somebody that knows how much money and the money that you can spend. As I said, we already have a PO with our recovery company, so getting the money to them is not a problem. And then you need someone to do the work. And Bill mentioned that we have a specific team of volunteers who have offered to come in or try to come in anyway when it comes to doing recovery. For us, that's always a delay because we do, and I'm assuming everybody else will have to get an all clear. Sometimes that can be a frustrating wait on our part, but we do have to wait until the university says it's okay for us to come into the building. All right, so let's see what else. The essential employees, those have to be designated on our personnel system. The university will control who can and cannot come onto campus. And so we have to double check at the beginning of every season or at least once a year to make sure that everyone has the correct designation. You'll notice again that tier 1 is missing. In most situations, most companies designate tier 1 as the people either dealing with the safety or anyone who's dealing with whether it's actually safe enough for your employees to come into the building. And then, mostly if you have significant damage, this is the kind of information that you want to track. There may, as I mentioned in the footnote, also want to take pictures of things. But if you have a large scale event where you're going to be recovering a lot of materials, you're probably going to end up using your LMS or other catalog document to keep track of what is where and what kind of recovery you needed to do on it. Last, just keeping in mind that you do need to do one of the best ways to enhance your plan is if you do have to deal with emergencies is to review how the response went. So we do this after every event. I guess unfortunately we have more than some people. But we always meet with the emergency management department here, and we talk about how our response went with them. And that's separate from facilities, it's a university group, and they direct the emergency management. So just keeping them on the loop and reminding them that we are a library, that the material here needs to be dealt with quickly, that it's not replaceable like the desks in the classrooms and that kind of thing is always a good idea. But you want to be sure that you're waiting a while, so you're not trying to get this on their calendar kind of the first day you're back at work, but you want them to have a chance to have reviewed their response so that they can give you a little bit better input. Yeah, that's not a mistake. You need to be so we always have this, we want to go through and say like this, you did this wrong, you did this wrong, you did this wrong, but of course that's not always the most effective way. So you have to be patient, or you have to be strategic in your discussion, particularly if it's at higher levels in the institution or the people that will be directing the next emergency response, so that they keep you in mind, but also want to help you. We often review the response with our own staff to make sure that everybody felt that everything went okay. If they had problems with any of their particular activity, we want to review that. And even further out, we try to catch up with other libraries in our region who have gone through the same emergency to see if they learned anything or they had any different issues than we did to try and respond to. We found that's another great way to make sure our plan is more built up, is to see what others have had to deal with, even if we haven't had the damage or the disaster that others may have had. All right, so I think I'm a little early, but if you have any questions now, of course, I'm happy to take them. But if you want to talk to me individually or have any questions for me separately, please feel free to contact me. And that is my contact information. But before we get to questions, I'm sure everybody else has, but I do want to take the opportunity to thank Heather and Michelle and Christine for creating this symposium. I think it's really useful, and I've heard a ton of very helpful things to help me in creating or dealing with other emergencies in the near future.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Robin. Let me see. For the questions, I think you answered one of the first ones about when you updated the plan
Mm-hmm.
already, and then there's the comment that
May Day, that's a great idea, yes.
Mhm. And then the last one, how do you balance noting locations of high priority collections and making that information easily accessible with keeping those collections safe and secure, like concerns of theft?
I would have to say that we do not have the most expensive things, and we don't identify necessarily what they are. Not too many people would recognize the value of what we actually have. So to the emergency people, who are the only people that really can be here before we get in, it's just going to look like a truck full of old books. And so we are lucky because our archival collection is actually off-site. So the university actually has better control of that particular department.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Your comment about other people not knowing necessarily what the valuable thing is makes me think of the no, not National Treasure, the Tom Hanks one, the Angels and Demons or Da Vinci
Oh,
Code,
right,
whatever,
right,
when he
right, right.
rips something out of like the Vatican archives. And it's always fun to tell like who's a librarian in the audience with that, because you hear like the gasp.
Yep.
And other people are like, oh no, that makes sense. um, We have another question. How would you advise libraries which are beholden to parent organizations like a university and are not free to create a disaster plan from scratch? For example, my library shares a building with our university administration and do not have control over our own facilities. Is it enough for us to defer all response matters to our parent organizations and focus solely on salvage measures?
Yes, it's an excellent question. That's obviously that's up to you. I would not. We are in a pretty good place right now with our parent organization, but we have not always been in that great of a place. And I made the joke that you can easily replace desks, but you can't necessarily easily replace a book from the 1600s. And so getting the parent organization to understand that has taken quite a while. I don't know about your situation, obviously, but I would still have my own plan. And even if I just kept it within my own department, we were actually kind of unhappy that the university, the bigger institution, actually started using our same restoration company because we felt that they would maybe direct it not to the same place that we would. But it actually has worked out in the opposite direction, so that they did, during the last storm, we had some minor flooding, or minor leaks, I should say. They actually directed the restoration company here before we even were in the building. So that kind of worked out for us. We actually share a building not with university administration, but with the law school. So we have lots of law school offices inside the library. And although we coordinate and we actually may be involved in helping them assess damages in those places, we still have our own plan. We do upload our plan on the university system, but that's in addition to what we provide to the university.
Could you say more about the closing procedures and moving material out of harm's way? How much time is allowed for these procedures?
So we have specific titles that we move. So we have about 4 different areas. It's not like we're trying to move an entire collection, and those are specific titles that we're moving, and we have specific places. So in our plan, the people who are moving them are designated specifically. We know how many book trucks it's going to take to move that material, and we know exactly where they're going to be moving it to. So it really doesn't take very long. So for us, if we were ever in a rush, we pretty much can get through most of our closing procedures, assuming most people are still here, in maybe about an hour and a half. And that's kind of an all hands on deck. You know, it's not a small group in the library that deals with that. Again, because of the way that hurricanes come, we usually have about, I don't know, 2 weeks, it seems like, to start worrying about these things. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but so the university doesn't always give us enough time, but we can do it pretty quickly. So it kind of depends on how much you need to move. We've also had years where we may have, it looks like a string of storms coming our direction. So it could be that, for example, we actually have a bit of an archival collection in one of the offices. And so, for example, we may just move the books onto a book truck to ready it a day or ahead, or if we've already put it on the book truck, we may not rush to put it back on the shelves if there's another thing that we're paying attention to.